Imagine a world where the biggest fear isn't war, disease, or winter. It's opening your eyes and realizing there may be nothing to eat today, and nothing you can do to work harder to fix it fast. That's the real Middle Ages. Not shining armor, not movie castles. The true center of medieval life was one brutal question: will there be enough food to survive the year? Here's the paradox: in a world where almost everyone worked the land, hunger was still normal. And an even stranger twist: people in cities often ate worse than villagers, even with markets, trade, and coins. Why? Because a peasant, even poor, usually had at least some access to soil, a garden strip, a few hens, a shared pasture, a place to stash grain. Soil meant a chance. A city worker had no soil. No animals. No hidden under floorboards that could grow again. Food had to be bought, and every loaf depended on roads staying open, merchants arriving safely, and harvests succeeding far beyond the city walls. If war erupted far away, bread prices in town could jump fast. Morning didn't start with an alarm, it started with sound. In villages, roosters, wooden doors, axes splitting damp logs; in towns, hammers, carts on stone, vendors shouting, dogs barking. No one started work, because work never truly stopped. A peasant opened his eyes already late, sow too late, harvest fails, rain too early, grain rots, horse gets sick, you become the horse. The land didn't forgive mistakes. The price of failure was simple: a hungry winter. And the ruler of this whole world wasn't a king, it was grain. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, not side dishes, but the foundation. Grain became bread, porridge, soups, flat cakes. The rich preferred lighter wheat bread, the poor ate darker, denser loaves made from rye or mixed flour, sometimes stretched with peas, acorns, whatever could be ground. Another twist: poor bread could be more filling and better for brutal labor than soft white bread. Meat, despite what films show, was rare for most people, not because they didn't want it, but because animals were more valuable alive. A cow meant milk and calves, sheep meant wool, chickens meant eggs. Killing an animal meant losing future food and income. So meat showed up mainly on feast days or when an animal was too old. Even then, nothing was wasted: bones into broth, fat saved, skins turned into tools or clothing. Cities smelled different: smoke, fish, spices, waste, sweat, and beer. Yes, beer. Water could be unsafe, especially in crowded towns. Wells got contaminated, rivers carried filth, so even children drank weak, small beer, with low alcohol, safer than water and full of calories. Then comes the question that flips the story: if city life was dirtier, pricier, more dangerous, why did cities grow? Because the city offered something the village often didn't: a chance to be more than what you were born into. Apprenticeship, craft, trade, guild membership, money, wages. But the chance came with risk. In the village you might starve slowly, in the city you could starve suddenly. And to understand how people survived that risk, we need to answer what their days really looked like, how they worked, how long, and why days off didn't mean rest at all. Medieval work didn't follow a clock, a contract, or a weekend. It followed light, weather, and survival. The modern idea of fixed hours would sound strange, because time wasn't measured like we measure it: no wristwatches, no time cards, no 9 to 5. The sun was the master. In summer, daylight meant brutally long days; in winter, it meant racing darkness and cold. But here's the key: they didn't think in hours worked, they thought in tasks finished. And the list never ended. A peasant family could begin before sunrise: feed animals, fetch water, split wood, grind grain, repair a tool, prepare a quick bite, usually leftovers, bread, or thin pottage, then to the fields. Plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, mostly hand tools, simple plows, hard muscles. Every motion spent energy, and every mistake cost food months later. Children worked too, not as a cruel exception, but as survival logic. A small child scared birds, gathered sticks, carried water. By early teens, they were full workers. Childhood as we know it barely existed, there was the slow process of becoming useful. Now the paradox: Medieval peasants sometimes had more break days than modern workers because the church calendar packed the year with feast days, dozens upon dozens. On paper it looks like a dream. In reality, those days rarely meant idleness. Heavy field labor might pause, but lighter work filled the gap, mending clothes, fixing fences, patching roofs, tending gardens, preserving food, cleaning tools. Rest meant different work, not no work. And when the season demanded it, especially harvest, there were no pauses. Harvest was a fight against time itself. Entire villages worked from dawn to stars, because rain could destroy everything in a single night. People slept less, ate on the move, pushed bodies hard, because a ruined harvest meant a starving winter. City workers lived a different rhythm, but not an easier one. A blacksmith ran fires hot enough to soften iron and breathed smoke daily. A baker often woke in the middle of the night to have bread ready for morning markets. Weavers bent over looms in dim workshops, straining eyes and backs. Porters hauled loads that crushed shoulders. Guild rule sometimes limited work, but demand and survival pushed people to work as long as light allowed. And unlike peasants, city workers paid for everything: food, rent, fuel, tools. No work meant no food. There was no barn of grain to fall back on. Another truth people miss: medieval labor was exhausting, but it was also skilled. Farmers read soil, animals, and weather without modern science. Coopers shaped barrels so tight they didn't leak. Masons raised stone walls that still stand today. Skill was survival, passed through hands and memory rather than books. And danger lived everywhere. A bad cut could turn deadly, a fall could ruin you for life. No insurance, no sick leave. If you couldn't work, your family suffered immediately. Add one more layer: people didn't only work for themselves. Peasants owed labor to lords and dues to the church. Part of their week might be spent working the Lord's land, and part of their harvest vanished as obligations. So even a good year didn't guarantee full stomachs. Meals became calculations. How much grain can we eat now and still last until spring? Can we slaughter a chicken, or do we need eggs? Every bite was a decision about the future. And that leads straight to food itself. What did a normal medieval meal look like, from morning to night, when most families lived on the edge between enough and not enough? A medieval day was measured in meals, but not like modern plates. Forget big breakfast, lunch, dinner. For many people, food was fuel stops designed to keep the body moving, not satisfied. Morning could begin with chores first: animals, fire, water, then something simple: yesterday's bread, hard enough to soak, dipped into weak ale, watered milk, or thin leftovers from the pot. That pot mattered more than any feast. The true king of medieval cuisine wasn't meat or fancy bread, it was pottage, a thick stew that could include grains, beans, onions, cabbage, herbs, maybe a scrap of fat for flavor if luck allowed. The pot might hang over the fire for days, constantly reheated, constantly changing, never truly empty, never truly full. You didn't follow a recipe, you followed survival. Midday food depended on season and workload. In planting or harvest, people ate in the fields, bread again, maybe cheese if the household had animals, onions or leeks pulled from the ground, peas or beans mashed into something filling. Salt was precious, important for taste and vital for preservation. Without it, winter survival dropped fast. In cities, the rhythm was similar but more dependent on markets. Workers often bought hot food from vendors: thick soups, grain pancakes, simple pies with vegetables or minced leftovers. Medieval street food was cheap and filling, but quality varied. With no refrigeration, spoilage was a daily threat. Fish could stink by afternoon, meat turned quickly. Honest vendors sold what they could, while others stretched ingredients too far. Spices sometimes helped flavor and preserve, but they also hid early spoilage. Another detail: many people didn't use plates like ours. Bread trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, served as plates. Food went on top, juices soaked in, then the trencher was eaten or given away. Spoons were common, knives were personal tools carried on belts, forks were rare in much of Europe until late. Hands did most of the work. Evening was the main meal, not because it was huge, but because it was the most substantial the household dared. More pottage, more bread, softer cabbage, a bit of salted fish, bacon fat for flavor in better days. On feast days, you might see real meat, on most days, you didn't. And here's the misconception: people weren't constantly drunk, but low-alcohol beer or ale was daily nutrition, often safer than water and full of calories. Children drank it weak and diluted. Wine in southern regions appeared too, often watered down. Drinks were fuel, not luxury. Nutritionally, medieval diets could be decent in good years, lots of fiber, vegetables, grains. The real problem wasn't balance, it was stability. A single failed harvest could break everything. Famine often arrived as shrinking, thinning, pottage becomes watery, bread gets stretched with peas or worse, wild greens get added, nettles, dandelion, anything edible. Hunger came in waves, not always overnight collapse. Cities faced an extra danger: supply chains. If carts didn't arrive, markets emptied fast. Bread shortages could trigger riots, and authorities feared hungry crowds because hunger breaks order from the inside. Bread was so critical that bakers could be punished for underweight loaves, because a small cheat in a hungry season could ignite a city. Food also became identity. White bread showed wealth, dark bread signaled labor, fresh meat meant celebration, salted fish meant survival. You could read class from a table without a single word. But the harshest test wasn't a single bad day. It was winter, and the terrifying mistake that could turn stored food into sickness inside your own home. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just a season, it was an audit. A cold test of every decision made during the year. Once frost hardened the fields, the land stopped giving, and whatever you had stored became your world until spring. Most households lived only a few bad weeks away from hunger, so preparation began months earlier. Grain was harvested, dried, stored in sacks or bins, sometimes in lofts above homes. But grain had enemies. Moisture meant mold meant illness, rats and mice chewed through wood and cloth. A single infestation could erase weeks of labor. Cats were not pets, they were security. Barns were sealed, traps set, yet losses still happened. Preservation was survival science without science: salt, smoke, drying, fermentation. Cabbage became sauerkraut or stored in cool cellars. Onions and garlic hung from rafters. Apples dried into rings. Beans and peas dried hard as stones to last months. Fish was salted or dried into stockfish, tough as wood, edible after soaking and boiling. Meat, when available, was salted or smoked above hearth fires. But salt cost money, so poorer families had less preserved meat, not because they lacked animals, but because they lacked salt to keep it safe. Then there was the silent killer: bad grain. In damp storage, rye could grow a fungus, ergot. People didn't know what it was. They only knew that after eating certain bread, neighbors might shake, feel burning pain, hallucinate, grow weak, lose fingers or toes as blood flow failed. Communities interpreted it as curses or punishment, because the cause hid in the bread meant to save them. Winter meals turned simpler and thinner. Fresh vegetables vanished except hardy roots stored in pits. Grain porridge became more common than bread because flour had to be stretched. Fat became precious energy, a spoonful could mean strength instead of collapse. Cold also changed everything. Bodies burned calories just to stay warm. Firewood ran low. Houses stayed smoky because chimneys were imperfect. Windows were small to keep heat, making rooms dark. Illness spread easily in cramped spaces where families and sometimes animals shared shelter for warmth. Animals were winter insurance and heat sources. A cow or goat might be brought closer, not only for safety but to use body heat. Chickens often stopped laying, removing an important protein source. If fodder ran out, animals weakened, and losing an animal before spring was like losing your savings overnight. Yet winter also created culture, with less fieldwork, evenings filled with repair, mending, and storytelling by firelight. Still, the worst period often wasn't deep winter. It was early spring, the hungry gap, when stores were nearly gone and new crops weren't ready. Meals shrank again, wild greens were gathered the moment they appeared, nettle soup returned, bread got mixed with ground peas or other fillers. People survived winter only to face the hardest weeks just before the next harvest. And now we hit the city problem: how did craftsmen who didn't grow anything survive these cycles at all? The answer was a powerful hidden system of rules and brotherhood, guilds. In the medieval city, survival wasn't built on land, it was built on skill. And the main engine protecting that skill was the guild, not just a job club, but training, identity, protection, reputation, and sometimes political power. Without a guild, a craftsman faced ruthless competition and hunger. With it, he gained rules, support, and a place in the machine that fed people who had no fields. The path began early. A boy might become an apprentice at 10 or 12. He didn't only learn a trade, he moved into the master's household, ate at his table, and lived inside the workshop. In exchange for years of labor, he received training through repetition until skill became instinct. A blacksmith's apprentice pumped bellows, cleaned tools, learned how metal behaved in fire. A baker's apprentice worked nights preparing dough. A weaver's apprentice learned patterns thread by thread. Training could last 5 to 10 years. Then came journeyman, literally day worker, skilled, paid wages, often traveling to learn more, but not yet allowed to open a shop. To become a master, you had to prove mastery, often by producing a masterpiece judged by guild leaders. Why did this matter for food? Because guilds regulated quality and prices to prevent chaos. Too many bakers could drive prices so low none survived, too few meant shortages and unrest. Guilds balanced supply, protected reputation, and created early safety nets. If a member got sick, died, or lost tools in a fire, the guild might help the family, not pure charity, but stability. They paid for funerals, organized festivals, shared meals, honored patron saints. Your guild was your insurance in a world without state welfare. But guilds had shadows too. They limited competition, blocked outsiders, slowed innovation, and made it hard for migrants or the poor to climb. Day laborers without protection lived one missed wage from hunger. Widows without connections could lose workshops. Newcomers did the dirtiest jobs. City life looked independent, but it wasn't. The city was a giant mouth fed by fields outside its walls. If harvests failed, grain prices rose, wages bought less, and hunger tightened. Craftsmen often lived above or behind their workshops, mixing home and labor in one space. The city sounded alive, hammering, sawing, wheels grinding, animals braying, vendors calling. It also burned easily. Fires spread fast through wooden streets. A spark from a forge or bakery could erase blocks. Fire didn't only destroy buildings, it destroyed stored food, tools, and jobs at once, turning a stable household into a hungry one overnight. Guilds helped rebuild, but recovery could take years. Even so, one force ignored guild rules, city walls, and trade routes. It could empty workshops, fields, and markets alike: disease. When illness struck, food and labor systems collapsed together, and the medieval world learned that the chain feeding them was only as strong as the bodies working it. Nothing moved faster in the medieval world than disease. Not armies, not merchants, not rumors. Illness slipped through gates and into homes, and when bodies fell, the food chain broke: fewer hands to sow, reap, grind, bake, carry. Cities were vulnerable: crowded homes, shared wells, waste in gutters, animals inside walls. People didn't understand germs, they blamed bad air, punishment, fate. But they understood fear. When sickness spread, markets emptied, travel slowed, workshops closed, and food deliveries faltered. Bakers died, carters stopped, fields went unharvested as workers fled or perished. Even healthy survivors could face hunger because the system feeding them stalled. The Black Death is the famous name, but outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, fevers came again and again. A single illness could wipe out a household's workforce at once. Yet here's the twist: after the worst waves, survivors in some regions sometimes ate better than before. Fewer people meant more land and resources per person, labor became scarce and valuable, wages rose, lords had to offer better terms to keep workers. Tragedy reshaped power. Still, daily fear remained, and people tried what they could: broths for strength, herbs, wine mixed with plants as medicine, avoiding obviously spoiled food. Some cities developed early quarantines, ships held outside ports, houses marked, movement restricted. Not perfect, not modern, but a learning curve. Quarantines created new problems. How do you feed households locked inside? Communities sometimes left supplies at doors. Survival depended on neighbors as much as on money. Disease also changed careers. An apprentice might rise faster if masters died, a peasant might gain better land. Social mobility cracked open briefly under pressure. But then comes another disruption that turned food into a weapon: war. Medieval war wasn't only battles, it was a moving disaster, and its first victim was always food. Armies didn't carry endless supplies. They lived off the land. Crops were trampled, barns emptied, animals seized, mills damaged, wells fouled. A family could survive a bad harvest, it could not survive an army eating a year of work in a day. Even friendly armies demanded contributions, forced supplies. Villages that refused risked ruin. Cities hid behind walls, but sieges stopped trade instantly. No carts, no deliveries, no fresh food. Prices exploded, rationing began, bread shrank, pottage thinned. Hunger became a weapon stronger than swords. Destroying crops and killing draft animals wasn't only cruelty, it was strategy. If an enemy starves, resistance collapses. War created refugees who fled into towns already short on food, tightening pressure further. Yet even in war, people tried to keep routine, plant when possible, milk animals, bake bread, rebuild barns. Because routine was survival. But when weather, disease, and war could all erase stability, people clung to something they believed had rules: faith and community. That shaped how they worked, fasted, feasted, and endured hunger. Religion structured medieval life as much as seasons did. The church calendar set rhythms of fasting and feasting, changing what people ate and when. Many days restricted meat from warm-blooded animals, pushing diets toward fish, bread, beans, vegetables, and dairy depending on local rules. This didn't always mean less food, it meant different food, and it made fish incredibly important even far from coasts, preserved by salting or drying and transported long distances. Feasts, on the other hand, were emotional explosions after restraint: better bread, richer ale, pies, roasted meats when possible. Not everyday indulgence, rare proof that hardship wasn't endless. Community mattered as much as belief. Villages shared ovens and mills, exchanged labor at harvest, helped quietly when one household struggled, partly kindness, partly survival logic, because next year the roles could reverse. In cities, guilds doubled as social and religious networks, supporting members in hard times. Monasteries stored food, brewed beer, grew herbs, raised animals, and sometimes stabilized regions during shortages by distributing supplies or knowledge. Faith also gave hunger meaning: a test, a warning, a mystery. That didn't fill stomachs, but it helped minds endure. And while the Middle Ages didn't end overnight, slow changes began reshaping survival: improved plows and harnesses, crop rotation, expanding trade networks, growing markets. More grain in good years meant more stability, which fed population growth, which expanded cities, which increased dependence on long-distance supply. Disease and labor shortages forced better terms for some workers, money wages mattered more, social mobility widened in places. The world was evolving from survival tied to a single harvest toward survival tied to markets and networks, bigger, faster, and fragile in new ways. Yet the core equation stayed the same: energy in versus energy out. Take away castles and legends and medieval life becomes a relentless daily negotiation with hunger, weather, and chance. Children became useful early, households worked as units, marriage often meant shared labor and shared risk, elders contributed through knowledge. Seasons ruled: spring planting and fear, summer exhaustion, autumn harvest urgency, winter rationing and repair, then the hungry gap before new crops. In cities, it was wages and markets: no work, no bread. Meals were decisions about the future: eat now or save for spring, sell goods for grain or keep tools, slaughter an animal or protect future milk and wool. Hunger was often quiet, smaller portions, thinner soup, yet joy still existed, festivals, weddings, shared meals, laughter that mattered because it proved temporary safety. Community was insurance, reputation could decide who helped you when disaster hit. Medieval people weren't passive victims of hardship. They were experts in endurance, adaptation, and practical knowledge passed hand to hand. And if that sounds distant, it shouldn't. Strip away supermarkets and delivery apps and the truth becomes uncomfortable. Civilization is only ever a few missed meals away from panic. The scale changed, vulnerability didn't. A broken supply chain can empty shelves fast, just like blocked roads emptied medieval markets. Conflict can disrupt food flows across continents, like war once burned fields. Illness can freeze labor and trade, like plague once did. The Middle Ages teach one hard, powerful lesson: abundance is not a guarantee, it's a system that must keep moving. Their world wasn't dark because people were weak, it was harsh because nature and society demanded constant effort. Yet they still built communities, crafts, culture, and hope. The real medieval story is not knights on banners. It's ordinary people waking up, unsure whether the year would be kind or cruel, and working anyway, planting anyway, sharing anyway, hoping anyway. Because in the end, medieval life was about endurance. And that endurance is why our world exists at all.